Basically, the Middle East has always been an area of conflict. But for the past 50 years or so, that conflict has been more or less contained. And this was largely due to an understanding between the West and the Arabs. When we speak of the West, we mean mainly the United States, which involved a hypocritical trade-off between the main players. The West, in effect, agreed to overlook what the OECD calls the democratic deficits of the region's autocratic regimes in return for them keeping the oil flowing and Israel secure. A year and a half ago, this unholy alliance began to unravel. Economic hardship was primarily to blame. The Arab masses also recognized that a privileged few with connections were unfairly benefiting from the system. They were also fed up with the abuse from civil servants and the police. What became known as the Arab Spring began in Tunisia on January the 14th, 2011, when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire and died. He'd been harassed by Tunisia's internal security forces and he'd had enough. Next, the movement struck Egypt. Later came Libya. Syria was hit with small-scale protests shortly afterwards, which has now developed into a full-scale civil war that shows no sign of abating. Even the relatively prosperous Gulf state of Bahrain was not immune. Public protests broke out there as well and have continued off and on ever since. The various uprisings had several things in common. First, they were, in the main, grassroots movements. They were not coups d'etat. They began almost haphazardly, taking the ruling regimes by surprise. The words "bekefi," kefaya, meaning enough, was on everybody's lips. Kefaya even gave its name to a political party which contested the Egyptian elections. Second, it was mainly young people who led the rebellions. Their main aim was not to seize power, but simply to improve their lives. Third, the unrest involved the middle class and included many young professionals. Fourth, women, unusually, were well represented in the demonstrations, mostly in Yemen and in Egypt. Fifth, social networking played an important role, and young, generally well-educated rebels used tweets, blogs, and Twitter to mobilize their supporters and head off the state's more cumbersome security apparatus. A new, more sophisticated kind of political opposition had emerged. In short, the Arab Spring had many progressive features which distinguished it from the angry, spontaneous, and easily suppressed popular outbursts of the past, such as the so-called bread riots in Egypt in 1988. However, the Arab Spring was very different from, say, the fall of communism, which was a region-wide uprising against a discredited ideology. In the Arab Spring, local conditions largely shaped events, and everywhere the outcome was different. The two most important of these conditions, local conditions, were religion and tribal affiliation. With regard to religion, we must first distinguish between the two main strands of Islam, Sunni and Shia. After the death of the Prophet, some of the faithful wanted to elect a new caliph by consensus. These became known as Sunni Muslims. Another group believed that Muhammad's successor should derive from the family of the Prophet, specifically Ali. These became known as Shiites. Tension grew between the two groups and a fierce battle broke out between them at Karbala in 681. The Sunnis, led by Muawiyah I and Hussein of the Prophet's family, was martyred. Thus was introduced the main schism in Islam. Today, Sunnis constitute about 75% of all Middle Easterners, Shia 25%. In many ways, the two sects are similar. They both subscribe to the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. Where the two sects differ most markedly is in their theological orientation. Sunnis believe that since the death of the Prophet, there's been a falling away from the caliphate's original purity. Therefore, the more extreme Sunnis, loosely referred to as Salafists, believe true Muslims should strive to regain an ideal world that has been lost. Shiites are more inclined to look forward. They believe that a 12th Imam, a sort of Messiah, will be revealed at some future date when the world will be purified of its sinfulness. Shiites constitute the majority in Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and probably Lebanon. A significant number of Shiites also live in Pakistan and in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which is linked to Bahrain by a causeway. Sunnis are everywhere else in the Middle East, including Turkey. However, Turkey's 10 million or so minority Alevi Muslims lean towards Shiism and share an emotional but not theological kinship with the Alawites in neighboring Syria. Finally, there is an ongoing debate, ijtihad, both Sunni and Shiite Islam over what constitutes the true way. Thus, in both Sunni and in particular Shia Islam, there are conflicting views about the meaning of jihad, holy war. Some seeing it as armed struggle, others as rhetorical persuasion. And there's also debate about the status of women. Neither Sunni nor Shia Islam should be regarded as a monolithic faiths. Sunnis in Saudi Arabia are different from Sunnis in Egypt. Lebanese Shia are different from those living in Iran. As in similar situations, think of Christianity's great schism of 1054, religious affiliation in Islam became politicized. Today it has morphed into rivalry between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia for not just the soul of the Middle East, but political influence as well. The same sectarian rivalry colors the politics of Iraq, which is mainly made up of Shiites, Sunnis and Kurds. The latter are also Sunni but speak Kurdish rather than Arabic. In Iraq, tribalism also plays an important role. Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Muslim, besides carrying out vendettas against Shiites, also tried to suppress the tribes in the interests of national unity. However, since the US-led invasion, there's been a resurgence of tribalism in Iraq, largely due to the US military working with tribal leaders in security matters, rather than with the only intermittently reliable Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. But to be fair, al-Maliki is not only constrained by the multi-sectarian framework of his coalition government, but by tribal factions in his own bloc as well. Some he can count on, others he can't. As for the Kurds, they are scattered across the borders of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, long victimized by the rulers of these states, especially by successive Turkish regimes. They dream of one day having their own independent state, or at least the freedom to enjoy their cultural exceptionalism. In northern Iraq, the Kurds are largely split between two tribes, once at odds with one another, but now more or less united. Masoud Barzani's Kurdish Democratic Party, the KDP, and Jalal Talabani's Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK. The other major Kurdish grouping is the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. It too has a presence in Iraq, but the movement is more widely based in Syria and has a strong following in Turkey, where their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, is currently in prison. The PKK is also factionalized along tribal lines. Lebanon is fractured not just along religious lines, but tribal lines as well. The government is made up of representatives of different religions. Their numerical strength legitimized by a 1943 National Pact, which was based on the results of a census conducted during the French Mandate in 1930. It prescribed a Maronite Christian president, a Sunni prime minister, and a Shiite Speaker of the House. The Druze, Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholics, and other sects are also recognized with lesser portfolios. Since 1930, the relative strengths of the three main religions has undoubtedly changed, and many believe Shiites now constitute the majority. Therefore, a new constitution should reflect that change. This is one of the main factors which fueled Lebanon's 25-year civil war that lasted between 1975 and 1990. Within each of Lebanon's religious groupings, there are also tribal factions. Therefore, we should distinguish between Shiites who come from the south of Lebanon and those who come from the Bekaa. So recently, those from the south lived in something like medieval servitude under the handful of powerful landlords. They were primarily engaged in agricultural pursuits, primarily the cultivation of tobacco. The Shiites in the Bekaa belonged to tribes, each of which followed its own traditions. Some educated their children, even enrolling them in Christian schools, and encouraged them to emigrate. Others preferred their children to stay at home and engage in local economic activities, mostly farming, but also smuggling and hashish cultivation. Tribalism plays an important role in the present Lebanese government. While it is dominated by Shiite Hezbollah, it also relies for support from the tribal bloc of the Maronite Christian General Michel Aoun, who ironically previously fought against the Syrian president in Lebanon and now supports it. His group has been rewarded with several seats in the cabinet, including, by the way, the energy portfolio, which is held by Aoun's son-in-law, Gibran Bassil. In Syria, both religion and tribal allegiances exert a powerful influence. The population is predominantly Sunni, approximately 70%, with sizable Christian and Druze communities, but the government is dominated by the minority Alawites, an obscure offshoot of Shiism. The regime is led by President Bashar al-Assad, who succeeded his father Hafiz. Although it is said that the regime follows a secular Ba'ath socialist line, it is perhaps best understood as being a closely knit family mafia supported by the Shabiha, band of mainly Alawite thugs, as well as government forces. Where the main power lies in Syria is open to debate. Is Bashar really a puppet manipulated by his family, or is he a powerful force in his own right? What we do know is that Anisa Makhlouf, Bashar's mother and widow of the former President Hafez al-Assad, exercises considerable authority. Rami, her nephew, is certainly the richest man in Syria. His wide-ranging business interests, including Syria's cell phone network, duty-free shops, and so on. Maha, Bashar's younger brother, heads the internal security forces and is well known for his ruthlessness. Bushra, Bashar's older sister, also has considerable influence and is said to have mediated successfully in serious family disputes. She is the widow of Atif Shawkat, who until his recent assassination was head of Syrian intelligence. Around this core are several key figures of varying degrees of loyalty. Some, such as Nawaz Faris, Syria's ambassador to Baghdad, a Sunni, have already defected. His departure to Iraq was facilitated by his role as leader of the Uwaida tribe, which straddles the Syria-Iraq border. Another reminder of how tribal affiliation complicates the politics of the region. Although the Assad clique was never popular, it did have credibility, having brought stability to Syria, which allowed the country's Sunni bourgeois merchant class to prosper, and its minority, Christians and Druze, to feel secure. Even so, the majority of Sunnis felt badly done to and had little liking for the Assad regime. In 1982, they rebelled in Homs, their main power base, where they were ruthlessly put down by Hafez al-Assad, who massacred an estimated 18 to 20,000 and destroyed a large part of the city. Now the Sunnis are rebelling again, this time with the open support from Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, and more shadowy assistance, mainly logistical, from the West. That the West has become involved in the Syrian conflict has more to do with regional politics than humanitarian concern, in spite of the West's protestations to the contrary. Almost alone among the Arab states, Syria has established good relations with nuclear-armed Iran, which has provoked opposition from both the West and Israel. Although the Alawite religion is an offshoot of Shia Islam, the alliance with Iran has less to do with religious solidarity than political opportunism. It was said when Hafez al-Assad was alive that war with Israel would be impossible without Egypt because of its military, and no peace without Syria because of its covert mischief-making. In short, Syria has customarily played the role of regional spoiler, and an alliance with Iran, which has declared its implacable commitment to the destruction of Israel, was well suited to Syria's foreign policy designs. Syria also had good relations with Russia, and to a lesser degree China, both of whom find their alliance with Syria, and by extension Iran, gives them leverage in Middle Eastern affairs, hence their continuing support for the Assad regime. How the civil war in Syria turns out is still difficult to predict. At the moment, Syria has overwhelming firepower, but the rebels, now generally referred to as the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, is waging an effective guerrilla campaign. The FSA is made up of mainly Syrian Sunni Muslims, but also includes a bewildering array of foreign fighters, financed mainly by wealthy individuals and organizations in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. At present, there are two outside political structures attempting to mediate. One is the Friends of Syria, which meets occasionally in Istanbul and is made up of mainly Western powers, but significantly not Syria's main backers, Russia and China. They have pledged financial support for a mediated solution, but so far they've had little impact. The Syrian National Council, the SNC, which is made up of generally well-meaning Syrian exiles of limited authority. Initially, the group met in Istanbul, but has since met in Cairo and Qatar, because governments would like to influence its deliberations. The SNC was originally headed by a Sorbonne professor, Burhan Galioun, but he has since been moved aside in favor of Abdul Basit Saida, a Kurdish exile living in Sweden. A curious choice, as very few Syrians would back a Kurdish-led organization with any degree of commitment. Supported primarily by France and Turkey, the SNC is dominated by Islamists, but at their last meeting, France and Turkey promoted a breakaway group. That is a small splinter group headed by Manaf Tlas, the first major defector from Assad's circle. Its chances of success are regarded as slim. Hopes of a negotiated settlement under UN auspices have now virtually collapsed. Originally, Kofi Annan headed a group of UN negotiators backed by the West, Russia and China and the Arab League, but it was undermanned and ultimately ineffectual. Since then, the veteran Algerian negotiator Lakhdar Brahimi has taken over, but he has been keen not to raise any hopes. Iran is now openly backing the Assad regime, though it denies that its help amounts to military intervention. China and Russia continue their support, though more circumspectly. Russia is a long-time ally and an important arms provider. It also has a major naval base at Tartus. Also, there are tens of thousands of Russian nationals living in Syria. Perhaps most importantly, Russia is keen to curtail the growing power of the Islamists, threaten the stability of Chechnya and the Caucasus as a whole. Ominously, the UN has reported numerous sightings of Chechens and other Central Asian nationals fighting on behalf of the rebels in Syria. There are two basic problems with regard to resolving the war in Syria. A military campaign to topple the Assad regime would be hugely complicated as well as costly, especially as it is known that the government has stockpiled chemical weapons. On the other hand, if left to fester, Syria will likely fall into further chaos, creating a political vacuum to be filled most probably by an Islamist regime, or worse, Islamist regimes. There are now numerous al-Qaeda sympathizers coming into Syria across its increasingly porous borders, some through Iraq, but also from the Gulf via Turkey. Collectively, the FSA would probably favor some form of Islamist government, but it is hardly united, being torn over matters of inclusiveness and degrees of Islamic policy, Islamic purity. What happens in Syria will likely have an impact on Lebanon. Indeed, the traditional political view in Syria is that the two countries should never have been separated after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Also, Lebanon's Shiite community has long maintained ties with Iran, initially religious but increasingly political. Therefore, Syria was able to facilitate Iran's foreign policy designs by channeling money and arms to Iran's closest political ally in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which were used to attack Israel. Shiite Hezbollah is both a political party and a militia. Alone among Lebanon's other political parties, it is allowed to maintain a well-armed militia, which is more powerful than the regular Lebanese army. This arrangement was agreed to under the terms of the 1989 Taif Agreement, which brought Lebanon's civil war to an end and gave legitimacy to a Syrian peacekeeping presence in Lebanon. But in 2005, Syria and its proxy Hezbollah were implicated in the murder of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, father of the current Prime Minister Saad Hariri, who was actively seeking international support for Syria's withdrawal from his country. Hariri's assassination prompted UN Resolution 1559 shortly afterwards, which obliged all foreign forces to leave Lebanon, i.e. Syria, but also Israel, which was occupying an area in South Lebanon. At present, a UN tribunal continues to investigate Hariri's death, but it is making very slow progress because of delaying tactics undertaken by Lebanon's Syria supporters. So far, Lebanon has been able to stay out of Syria's conflict. Memories of its own long civil war still linger, and no one wants to take the blame for restarting it. However, a wild card is the 450,000 or so Palestinian refugees living in camps in Lebanon. Essentially stateless, they have limited opportunities for work in Lebanon and are unable to emigrate. They spend their time praying, procreating, and learning how to fight. Mainly Sunnis, their sympathizers are torn between Syria for its stance against Israel and their co-religionists in the SFA. So far, they have not been drawn into the conflict, but they remain a regional time bomb. If Syria were to break up, the tenuous peace that presently exists in Lebanon would come under pressure. The Taif Agreement that ended the civil war was supposed to regulate, if not resolve, Lebanon's constitutional issues, but it never really took hold. Factional rivalries remained, and they burst out with renewed vigor after Prime Minister Rafik Hariri's assassination. This prompted both pro- and anti-Syrian demonstrations, from which emerged two roughly equal blocs: the pro-Syrian March the 8th Alliance and the anti-Syrian March 14th Alliance. At present, the Lebanese government is trying not to be drawn into Syria's civil war. The Hezbollah-dominated pro-Syrian alliances continues to back the Assad regime. The anti-Syrian alliance does not. So far, both the March 18th and the March 14th alliances are united in refusing to compromise Lebanon's neutrality. But it's becoming increasingly difficult for each side to rein in its more passionate supporters. Incidentally, today, we discovered that the Hezbollah operative was killed I think it was in Aleppo, an indication perhaps that the Lebanese Hezbollah is now taking a more active role in support of the Assad regime. Lebanon's economy, which is coming under stress, is also adding to the inflammatory nature of the situation. Although Egypt is not directly implicated in the events in Syria, it could be drawn in. In Egypt, the Arab Spring resulted in the removal from power of Hosni Mubarak and his two sons, Salah and Gamal, and their cronies. They were first replaced by an interim government made up of military men, led by the former Army and Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, was well known and appreciated in Washington. This group, known as the Security Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, has said it is committed to democracy and the restoration of civilian rule, but doubts remain over its intentions. It seems unlikely that the military will cheerfully step aside entirely. It has too much to lose. It plays a crucial role in Egypt's economy, being involved in a wide range of activities, including munitions, textile manufacturing, real estate, potato farming, and supermarkets. The actual extent of the army's involvement has always been a state secret, so few know how big their stake actually is, but it has been variously estimated by some to be as high as 35% of GDP. What is encouraging, however, is that the President Morsi is turning out to be a clever politician and is quietly asserting his authority over the military without alienating them. He has removed from office Field Marshal Mohammed al-Tantawi and replaced him with a less slavish courtier to Americans in American interests, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Morsi has also quietly removed the senior military officers and appointed Brotherhood members to several key governorships, another move which boosts his authority. What we're witnessing in Egypt appears to be a quiet takeover by the Muslim Brothers, who so far have handled their newly won power with considerable finesse. Finally, the so-called peace process. Israelis see it as primarily a security issue. For the Arabs, it is now more about cultural assertiveness and the restoration of Arab pride. What happens in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and by extension Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq could all have repercussions for Israel and the Palestinians. Currently, the formal resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is predicated on the so-called roadmap drawn up by the Quartet, which includes the US, UN, EU, and Russia, and it has four main points: two contiguous democratic states living in peace within secure borders, a Palestinian state which should approximate its pre-1967 borders, 3, Jerusalem to be a shared capital, and 4, the right of return or compensation for displaced Palestinians. In 2002, this vision for the future was endorsed by all 21 states of the Arab League, and in return the Arabs agreed not just to accept Israel's right to exist, but for it to live in peace within secure borders. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians respected this arrangement from the beginning. Israel did not stop building illegal settlements. The Palestinians did not give up their armed struggle. Hamas, an extremist political faction which has come to power in Gaza, continued its military activity, receiving covert support from Iran and elsewhere. At present, the Palestinian administration is divided between Gaza's Hamas, led by Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, and the West Bank's less militant, more secular Palestine National Authority, which is dominated by Fatah and led by Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. Attacks against Israel from both Gaza and the West Bank have been reduced considerably, but settlement building in the West Bank has accelerated. So-called defensive wall snakes its way through the West Bank, making free movement for Palestinians either difficult or impossible. Israel says it is for defense, but it also appears to be a land grab. The West is caught in a bind. On the one hand, it supports the moderate government of Mahmoud Abbas, both diplomatically and financially, and is holding Hamas at arm's length. For progress to be made, the two factions will have to coordinate more closely. However, since the Arab Spring, the political dynamic may have changed, making a working partnership less likely. Mr. Abbas, who rules by edict, is far from popular at home and has little to show for his willingness to act as a partner for peace with Israel. If the Islamists are seen to be gaining the upper hand in Syria, as well as in Egypt, Jordan, and elsewhere, his authority will likely be further undermined. It's difficult to measure whether the Arab Spring has had much impact on the peace process. So far, there is little tangible evidence of any concerted pressure on Israel. However, Egypt now appears to be pursuing a more independent line. In response to local pressure, the Egyptian military has relaxed its border control with Gaza at Rafah. While Mubarak was in power, he made sure that the many tunnels under the border, which served as a conduit for smuggling merchandise and arms, mainly from Libya, were effectively monitored. Now Israel fears that under the Islamist regime, this control may be relaxed. There have already been armed clashes on the Rafah border, resulting in Egyptian deaths. Also, the rumors of the Al-Qaeda being present in the Sinai, and the Bedouin there have cut the natural gas line several times to Israel. While Israel may come under increased pressure as a result of political changes in the region, for the moment at least, this is unlikely to be translated into military action. In fact, al-Morsi has surprised many by keeping Gaza's Hamas at arm's length. Uppermost in most Arab minds is simply to improve their economic conditions. Hence, in Egypt, besides meetings with top US officials, mainly in a bid to secure debt relief and further loans, President Morsi's earliest diplomatic initiative was to visit China, with a view to drumming up aid and trade. More controversial was his brief stopover in Tehran to address the conference of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. There he upset his hosts by refusing to support Mr. Assad's beleaguered regime, but simultaneously tried to reassure Iran that Egypt was nonetheless a true friend. In a move bound to create upset in the United States, Morsi has since pointed to the obvious by saying that any settlement to the crisis would have to take into account Iran's interests. He therefore proposed a new team of mediators made up of representatives from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey and Egypt. This is a proposal unlikely to take hold, but is another indication of Egypt seeking a new independent role in the Middle East. So far, Israel's policy with regard to these new threats remains outwardly unchanged. To make use of Ehud Barak's metaphor, they still see themselves inhabiting a villa in the jungle, so they must be vigilant and prepared to ward off unwelcome intruders. Nor it seems as Israel made up its mind how to tackle Iran's nuclear program, other than to speak noisily about red lines. So far, Israel's instinctively aggressive posture towards Iran appears to have been reined in by the US, which continues to hope that economic sanctions and under-the-radar cyber attacks will prove to be an adequate deterrent. Polls in Israel also suggest that there is little stomach for a full-scale attack against Iran, a view endorsed by several well-respected figures in Israel's intelligence community. Whether Israel will continue to heed international pressure or attack Iran remains to be seen. In recent years, Israel has become increasingly belligerent, and Prime Minister Netanyahu remains relatively popular at home, has swung his Likud party further to the right, partly from instinct but also in order to keep his right-wing parliamentary coalition together. The largest pro-Israeli lobby in the US, AIPAC, continues its wholehearted support for Netanyahu, but AIPAC's admittedly much tinier rival, the J Street lobby, is less enthusiastic. It believes that the greatest threat to Israel's existence is not from outside aggressors, nor from Arabs living in Israel and the occupied territories. It comes from a demographic imbalance, which Israeli historian Benny Morris identifies as Israel's primary existential threat. This was also recognized by no less a fervent militarist than Ben-Gurion, who counseled against annexing the West Bank after the 1967 war because, he said, if Israel did, it would be unable to remain both Jewish and democratic. Demographers differ over the date when Arabs will outnumber Jews in Israel and the occupied territories, but all agree it will be well within the lifetime of the majority of Israelis living today. Unfortunately, this existential threat has not led to an increased willingness on the part of Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians. On the contrary, the present trend seems to suggest that most Israelis are more comfortable living in an apartheid regime than reaching out to the peacemakers. Finally, forgive this gallop. I tried to get as much in as possible, but I'll try and fill in the details if you have any questions. It's just such a long, sweeping panoramic phenomenon. It's very difficult to get to the details, to get to give a clear idea without getting into the details. Anyway, a look at the Arab Spring, the way it has raised the profile of two states, tiny Qatar and Turkey. The present ruler of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad ibn Khalifa al-Thani and his family are open, albeit guardedly, to Western ways. Witness their enthusiasm for Western-style education institutions and their tolerance for the increasingly popular and independently minded Al Jazeera television channel. Qatar also sided with the West in regulating the situation in Libya, providing military and diplomatic support for the NATO-led invasion. Though tiny, Qatar has huge revenues from its natural gas reserves, which also enable it to exert considerable influence worldwide. Let's consider its influence in the UK property market. It owns Harrods now, it owns the iconic building called the Shard, which towers over the London's landscape. While Qatar insists it wants to be friends with everybody, it also emphasizes its strong commitment to Islamic values. Hence, it offered safe haven for the Hamas leadership when they decamped from their headquarters in Damascus. Qatar is also said to have provided funds for at least one of the Islamist parties in Libya, and in Syria it is openly supporting the FSA. Whether Qatar will be able to maintain its delicate balancing act between East and West remains to be seen. Most interesting is the enhanced international status of Turkey, which is seeking to supplement its growing economic clout with a more prominent diplomatic role. If Turkey is to realize its ambition, it must tread carefully. After World War I in 1923, when it lost its empire, and the secularizing Ataturk had come to power, Turkey's initial orientation was towards Europe. In 1952, it joined NATO, where its huge army on the border with the former Soviet Union made it the West's vital ally during the Cold War. Later, Turkey focused on joining the EU, but in the face of opposition from many EU members who believe that EU should be a Christian club, and that Turkey is anyway too big a mouthful to digest, Turkey began to reorient its foreign policy, quite literally, towards the East. This is a trend which has been supported by the population, according to recent Pew Research polls. In recent years, Turkey has sought to win friends throughout the Middle East, mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran over Iraq, and between the West and Iran over the imposition of economic sanctions designed to stop Iran's nuclear program. In 2011, Turkey also announced the establishment of a free trade zone between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. With regard to Turkey's courtship of its Arab neighbors, one should not underestimate the hugely popular Turkish soap operas such as Nur, The Sultan's Harem, and The Magnificent Century, dubbed in colloquial Arabic and shown at prime time throughout the Arab world. Essentially, they portray an idealized picture of Ottoman rule, more flesh than you would find in their Arab equivalents, laced with family intrigue. Also, they tend to portray strong, capable women who have the courage to walk out on overbearing husbands without suffering the consequences. Overall, their effect is to remind the Arabs of their rich cultural heritage and simultaneously that Islam and modernity can coexist. The US has also encouraged Turkey to become more actively involved with its Arab neighbors, hoping that the mild Islamicism of Turkey's ruling AK, or Freedom and Justice Party, in power since 2003, might become a template for new governments in the region. This is happening when Saudi Arabia, which used to be the region's main power player, is beginning to lose some of its influence. Qatar also seems to recognize Turkey's increasingly important role, judging by the increase of their bilateral visits. Since 2001, several important agreements have been signed between the two with regard to economic investment, double taxation, and military cooperation. Particularly noteworthy are the close personal ties between Turkey and Tunisia, where the ideologically friendly Ennahda party constitutes the majority of the newly formed government. The foreign policy orientation of both Qatar and Turkey sits well with US policy for the region. However, Turkey also values its independence and does not want to be seen as a Western proxy. When the US Congress passed a non-binding resolution 2 years ago affirming that the World War I massacre of Armenians was genocide, Turkey reacted angrily and called in the US ambassador for a dressing down. Turkey's newly independent line was demonstrated most forcefully when in 2011 it sided with the BRICS, refusing to toe the line with the US to impose sanctions on Iran. On that occasion, Turkey sided with Brazil, China, and Russia and voted against sanctions. Turkey's increasingly independent stance has also meant a cooling of its relations with Israel. Turkey and Israel once had close military ties and even staged joint military exercises. More recently, their relationship has turned sour, and Erdogan openly walked out on the Israeli delegation in Davos 2009 over Israeli attacks on Gaza. Later, when Israel refused to apologize to Turkey for the attack on the flotilla of Turkish peace activists bound for Gaza in early 2012, Turkey broke off diplomatic relations. Turkey's more aggressive foreign policy is also reflected in its pursuit of the repatriation of artifacts important to its cultural heritage, such as the reputed sarcophagus of Alexander the Great, presently housed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Insiders in Turkey attribute this heightened assertiveness partly to Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan's determination to recapture some of the lost glory of the Ottoman Empire. Like the late Charles de Gaulle, he seems to identify personally both with his country's cultural heritage and his foreign policy. That's why Mr. Erdogan appeared to be more than diplomatically aggrieved when President Assad, with whom he thought he had a close personal understanding, refused to follow his advice and cooperate with Kofi Annan's UN peace initiative. After the shooting down of a Turkish fighter over Syria, which Turkey condemned as an act of war, the relationship between the two countries appeared turned from cool to frigid, and there has since been a break in diplomatic relations. While Mr. Erdogan may be personally aggrieved with President Assad and eager to remain friends with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the hardening of Turkey's stance vis-à-vis Syria is also influenced by Turkey's awkward relations with the Kurds. Initially, Turkey's ruling AK party was quite tolerant towards the 13 million or so Kurds on its soil, and even admitted that the government had made mistakes when dealing with them. Since then, its position has hardened. It now worries that if Syria falls apart, the more militant Kurds, notably the PKK and its sympathizers, might find safe haven there and cause trouble. So far, there is no united stand among the Kurds living in Syria. Some groups still support President Assad, others the FSA. Finally, it should be noted that Turkey's increasingly important role in the Middle East is matched by a decline in the regional influence of and support for the United States. The US lost considerable credibility during the Arab Spring in Egypt, for example, because it refused to commit itself on behalf of the rebels until it was absolutely sure that the Mubarak regime was finished. Most Arabs are now acutely aware of the discrepancy between the democratic sentiments expressed by President Obama in his 2009 Cairo University address, entitled, ironically, A New Beginning, an American Practice, especially with regard to the Palestinians. There's also a growing conviction among Arabs that the West, particularly the US, is viscerally anti-Muslim. Events such as the recent airing of the defamatory YouTube clip about the Prophet, which led to widespread unrest in Benghazi, Cairo, Yemen, and elsewhere, only serves to underline that view. The fact that the film was made by a disaffected expatriate Egyptian Copt with extremist views is lost on the Arab masses. The majority seem to believe it is a true reflection of official US government attitudes. Now, I apologize for having galloped through this, but I hope that I'll be able to fill in any gaps in this roundtable discussion. I wanted to cover all the bases because one of the things which people refer to the Arab Spring, they tend to think of it as tend to think of it in terms of just the rise of the Islamists. But I wanted to show this a very complex phenomenon where different countries have different priorities and different situations. Some are driven by tribal considerations, some are by religious consideration, and indeed there's no such thing as an Arab Islamic world as such. It is a very diffuse block of people, and we should try and take that on board. Thank you.